September 1945, Tokyo Bay, Japan. Aboard the battleship USS Missouri, hundreds of Allied officers stand in crisp uniforms under a burning sun, watching a historical moment unfold. The Japanese surrender delegation climbs the metal stairs onto the gray deck. General Yoshijiro Umezu and Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu lead the group. The air is heavy and freezing with tension. The defeated military leaders stand frozen in the center of the deck. They keep their backs completely straight. They refuse to offer a single traditional bow or a military salute to the victors. Umezu stares forward with total ice in his eyes, trying to turn an unconditional surrender into a negotiated truce between equal warriors. He believes his defiance protects the unbroken honor of his empire. But an American general is waiting, ready to deliver a quiet, devastating response that will completely dismantle their remaining pride. The real reason Japanese generals refused to bow to MacArthur on the USS Missouri. This is the story of how a defiant Japanese military delegation tried to claim equality in defeat, only to be completely stripped of their dignity by a cold, calculated display of Allied authority. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the moments that forced people to face what they had done. Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright was 62 years old, from Walla Walla, Washington, and had previously commanded all Allied forces in the Philippines. He was a physically shattered survivor of the Bataan Death March. For more than 3 brutal years, he endured starvation and physical abuse inside a remote Japanese prisoner of war camp. His body was thin, hollowed out, and heavily scarred from years of mistreatment. His skin clung tightly to his cheekbones. His oversized khaki uniform hung loosely off his gaunt frame. Only days prior, Allied troops had pulled him from his cage. Yet, despite the immense pain racking his joints, he stood with his chin held high on the deck. He was the living embodiment of silent endurance, representing millions of prisoners who had suffered under the boots of the conquerors. He stood directly behind the leadership, waiting for the final reckoning. General Yoshijiro Umezu was 65 years old, from Oita Prefecture, and served as the chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff. He was a fierce, unyielding militarist who had fought bitterly against the concept of surrender until the final hour. He only agreed to step onto the warship because of a direct, sacred command from the emperor himself. He stood with an incredibly rigid, unbroken posture in the center of the deck, clutching his long, ceremonial samurai sword. His dark eyes were filled with a cold, silent defiance and deep resentment toward his captors. He wore a crisp, immaculate dress uniform adorned with polished medals, representing a family legacy of elite samurai privilege. He firmly believed the imperial army remained undefeated in spirit. He vowed that he would never bow his head or acknowledge the enemy officers, determined to maintain absolute military honor in total defeat. By September 1945, the vast Pacific War was finally over. The intense fighting had stopped, but the entire region remained in complete chaos. Cities were flattened by heavy bombings. Millions of displaced civilians wandered through destroyed landscapes, looking for food and shelter. The collapsing imperial government left behind an immense power vacuum across East Asia. Allied forces rapidly moved into occupied territories to disarm millions of active Japanese soldiers. The sudden shift in power created dangerous, unpredictable situations every day. Many frontline commanders were unsure how to handle the deeply rooted pride of their former enemies. In some areas, lower-ranking officers allowed surrendering local commanders to retain their personal sidearms. They let small signs of arrogance slide just to keep the peace and prevent further bloodshed. They wanted a smooth transition, even if it meant tolerating minor insults to Allied authority. They did not want to risk triggering a final, desperate guerrilla war in the mountains. But this submissive attitude was creating a terrible precedent. It allowed the defeated leadership to pretend their warrior code was still intact. It let them believe they were giving up on their own terms. The massive gathering in Tokyo Bay was supposed to be the ultimate statement of absolute victory. Yet, the tense standoff on the cold deck of the battleship threatened to ruin the entire message. The stiff posture of the military delegation was a direct test of Allied resolve in front of the world. The unyielding generals stood firmly in their boots, waiting to see if anyone would dare to challenge their silent rebellion. An American liaison officer walked toward the center of the deck to greet the newly arrived Japanese delegation. He stopped exactly 3 paces away from General Yoshijiro Umezu. The American offered a firm, professional nod, expecting the traditional military customs to begin. Umezu did not move a single muscle. His hands remained tightly locked on the hilt of his samurai sword. He stared straight ahead, completely looking past the officer as if the man were entirely invisible. The American officer adjusted his cap, keeping his voice steady and low. He stated that the formal proceedings required a mutual show of respect before the signing could commence. He asked the general to lead his delegation in a customary salute to the Allied command structure assembled on the ship. Umezu tightened his grip on his sword. He spoke in a cold, sharp tone, his words cutting through the heavy silence of the deck. He stated that the Imperial Army does not bow to its enemies. He claimed his forces were never truly defeated on the field of battle. He insisted that they only stopped fighting because the Emperor chose to spare the world from further destruction. He declared that they were on the ship to sign a negotiated armistice between equal, proud nations, not to beg for mercy like common criminals. The American liaison officer stepped forward, his face turning rigid. He cited the explicit Supreme Command regulations regarding total and unconditional surrender. He informed the general that every member of the delegation was required to follow the strict protocol established by the Allied powers. He made it clear that refusal to comply would be viewed as a direct violation of the Supreme Command orders. Umezu scoffed, his face twisting with deep contempt. He said that paper regulations mean nothing to a samurai. He stated that the Americans could occupy the land, but they could never conquer the spirit of the warriors. He claimed that forcing a proud army to humiliate itself would only breed permanent hatred. He refused to give any sign of submission, stating his delegation would stand on the deck as equals, or they would leave the vessel immediately. The American officer realized this open defiance was far beyond his authority to handle. He knew any sudden argument could ruin the historical ceremony in front of the international press. He stepped back slowly, turning away from the stubborn delegation. He walked quickly toward the upper bridge to report the brewing crisis to the senior leadership. The urgent message reached General Douglas MacArthur within the minute. General Douglas MacArthur stepped onto the gray deck with deliberate, theatrical confidence. He wore his signature crushed officer cap and dark aviator sunglasses. His khaki uniform was open at the collar and completely bare of any medals. He carried no weapons, yet his presence radiated supreme authority. Every eye on the battleship locked onto his movement. He did not look at the Japanese delegation. He completely ignored their rigid, defiant posture as he walked past them. He did not say a word to them, maintaining an icy composure that froze the entire deck. MacArthur looked at the American liaison officer. He asked if the documents were ready on the table. The officer answered that everything was in place. MacArthur asked if the Japanese delegation had been informed of the protocol. The officer replied that they understood but refused to salute or bow. MacArthur asked if they believed their defiance would alter the terms of the document. The officer said they claimed to be equals. MacArthur studied the delegation for a brief moment. He spoke in a low, resonant voice that carried easily across the crowded deck. He stated that they did not stand on the ship as equals. He said the time for negotiation had ended weeks ago on the battlefield. He noted that their pride could not alter the reality of their total defeat. He looked toward the gaunt, emaciated survivors of the prison camps standing nearby. He stated that those broken men were the true witnesses to the end of the conflict. He made it clear that the ceremony would proceed exactly under his terms. He offered them a binary choice. They would step forward and sign the document in silence, or they would be removed from the ship and face immediate military execution. Umezu glared at the general, his jaw tightening into a hard line. He realized his silent rebellion had completely failed to provoke a reaction. He saw that MacArthur would not engage in a petty argument over military etiquette. The absolute indifference of the commander stripped the delegation of their remaining leverage. Umezu knew his options had completely vanished. He looked down at his polished boots, his pride fracturing under the weight of the moment. He stood frozen, waiting for the final command to face the consequence of his actions. MacArthur stepped forward to execute his final verdict. He did not engage in any negotiation or demand a display of submission. Instead, he carried out a strict, pre-arranged plan to strip the delegation of their remaining status. He enforced a rigid, absolute policy of no salutes and no handshakes. He treated the proud military officers as defeated, low-level state functionaries. MacArthur walked to the microphone and delivered his formal, low-affect address. The words boomed across the silent water of Tokyo Bay. When the moment arrived to sign the heavy documents, he engineered a deliberate, highly public display of vindication. He pulled out 5 separate fountain pens. He signed the first parts of his name, then turned around to face the crowded deck. He handed the first 2 pens directly to Jonathan Wainwright and British General Arthur Percival. He did this directly in front of the frozen Japanese officers. The defeated delegation watched in total silence as the thin, heavily scarred former prisoner of war accepted the instrument of victory. The sharp smell of ocean salt and ship fuel hung heavy in the air. Hundreds of Allied sailors stood on the gun turrets, staring down at the broken leaders. MacArthur completely shattered their pride without raising his voice, forcing them to sign the total, unconditional surrender in absolute, freezing humiliation. Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright returned home to Walla Walla, Washington, after the conclusion of the conflict. He received the Medal of Honor for his extreme bravery and sacrifice during the defense of the Philippine Islands. He spent several years recovering his physical strength in quiet comfort, though his body remained marked by the terrible starvation of the camps. He lived out a peaceful retirement among his family, passing away in 1953 at the age of 70. He kept the first fountain pen from the historic ceremony on his desk for the rest of his life as a constant reminder of survival. General Yoshijiro Umezu faced a very different future after stepping off the warship. He was arrested by Allied authorities within months of the signing and placed on trial for severe war crimes before the International Military Tribunal in Tokyo. He was convicted for his aggressive actions and received a sentence of life imprisonment. He remained inside his cell, bitter and unyielding, refusing to apologize for his wartime decisions until his death from illness behind bars in 1949 at the age of 69. General Douglas MacArthur rarely discussed the specific defiance of the delegation in his official reports. He focused instead on the massive logistics of organizing the occupation of the home islands. He did mention the tense standoff briefly in a private letter to his wife, noting that pride is a hollow shield when a commander has lost the field. He wrote that true authority is never established by arguing with a defeated foe, but by rendering their defiance completely irrelevant. Some historians have argued that the cold, absolute indifference displayed by the Allied command structure was far more devastating than any open show of anger. They claim that by completely ignoring the rigid defiance of the Japanese delegation, the leadership stripped them of their final opportunity to act as honorable, undefeated warriors. Others have argued the opposite, suggesting that a more confrontational approach would have risked triggering a desperate, violent backlash among the millions of active imperial troops still stationed across the Pacific region. What is certain is that the icy composure maintained on the battleship established an absolute, unshakable precedent for the entire post-war occupation of the Japanese home islands. If you had been in the Allied command position, would you have ignored their rigid defiance to strip away their dignity, or would you have forced them to salute under threat of arms? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the moments that forced people to face what they had done, make sure to subscribe.